So 3.2, we're going to talk about complex numbers. So what makes a complex number is the imaginary unit I. I comes from the square root of -1. So it's super important to know that I is the square root of -1. If we have a negative under our square root, under the radical, it turns into an I. And then also if we have I squared, that is equal to -1. So I squared is actually a real number. It would be -1. So on the bottom, it gives us a couple examples. So if we have the square root of -3, we would take the negative out from under the radical and turn it into an I. So that would be I square root 3. And then if we had I square root 3 squared, that squared gets distributed to the I and the square root 3. So that would be I squared and square root 3 squared. So what did we say that I squared is? -1. And square root 3 squared, the square root and the squared cancel, so that would be 3. And what is -1 times 3? -3. So let's do some more examples on the next page. So we want to find the square root of each number. So first thing we want to do, anytime we see a negative under the radical, we want to take it out and turn it into an I. So it gets rid of that negative. Now we have I times the square root of 25. They're going to be negative because we're dealing with imaginary numbers. If it's positive, you just leave it. Okay. What's the square root of 25? 5. So this would be 5I. The number always comes before the I, just like we would say 5x, not like x5. Just the number is the coefficient, it comes first. Any questions here? Then we have to break it down. So let's take the negative out, turn it into an I. Don't forget to put the I in your answer. Now let's break down the square root of 72. What are 2 factors of 72? 9 and 8. Perfect. What are 2 factors of 9? 3 and 3. And 2 factors of 8? 4 and 2. Can I break down anything anymore? 4. So we want to break it down into the prime factors, so we can't break it down anymore. And we circle groups of 2. So I have 2 3s and 2 2s. So what's going to come to the outside? Awesome. 3 times 2. What else comes to the outside? The I. So 3 times 2 times I. What stays on the inside? The 2. And then lastly, we just need to do 3 times 2. Since we took 2 things outside, we multiply them together. So this would be 6I square root 2. For C, what should I do first? Before I break it down, what do I see that I have on the inside? I'm going to take the negative out and turn it into an I. Now we can break it down, but what's the square root of 9? 3. So on the outside, I have -5I and 3. So let's multiply our numbers together. What's -5 times 3? -15I. All right, let's do a couple more. So let's look at number 2. What would we do first for number 2? Take the negative out, and what does it turn into? An I. Now let's break down the square root of 12. What are 2 factors of 12? 6 and 2. Or you could have said 4 and 3. You'll end up with the same answer. What are 2 factors of 6? 3 and 2. So I circle what here? 2 2s. So what comes to the outside? 2I. Awesome, because we already had an I on the outside. What stays on the inside? The 3. What should I do first for number 3? Take the negative out and it turns into an I. So now outside I have negative I. Inside, I just have the square root of 36. 36 is a perfect square, so what's the square root of 36? 6. So what comes to the outside now? Negative 6I. Awesome. Yeah, because we took the square root of 36 was 6, so it comes to the outside. Now I have nothing left on the inside. So what should we do first for number 4? Take the negative out, turn it into an I. Now we have 2I on the outside. Let's see what the square root of 54 is. What are 2 factors of 54? 9 and 6. And 2 factors of 9? 3 and 3. 2 factors of 6? 3 and 2. So what would we circle here? How many 3s? 2 3s. So what else is going to come to the outside? We have a 2I already on the outside. What else comes to the outside? A 3. What stays on the inside? 3 times 2. So if more than one thing stays on the inside, we multiply them together. If more than one thing comes to the outside, you multiply them together. So what's 2I times 3? 6I. And what's 3 times 2? 6. So our answer here would be 6I square root 6. So a complex number is written in standard form. It says A plus BI. So where A is the real part, so the real part comes first. And B is the imaginary part. So the imaginary part would be second. So if I had something like 5 plus 4I, 5 would be the real part. And the real part comes first. 4I is the imaginary part because it has the I. And the imaginary part always comes second. So in standard form, the real part comes first. All right. So if we have a complex number equals another complex number, we can set the real parts equal to each other. So the parts that don't have i's are going to be equal to each other. And then the imaginary parts we set equal to each other. So the parts with i's. So here, what is a term that doesn't have an I? 2x. And what's a term on the right side that doesn't have an I? 10. So we would say 2x is equal to 10. So we're going to solve for x there. Now let's set up our other equation with the imaginary parts. What's a term that has an I on the left side? Negative 7i. That negative stays with the 7, so negative 7i. And then that would be equal to what? yi. So we have 2 separate equations here. We're going to solve for x, and then we're going to solve for y. So on our equation on the left, we have 2x equals 10. What would we do to solve for x? Divide by 2. So x is equal to 5. In our equation on the right, what do we do to solve for y? Awesome. Divide by I. So it cancels out there and cancels out here. So what does y equal? Negative 7 is equal to y. So those would be our 2 answers. So you just have to set up 2 little equations with the real parts and then the imaginary parts. And then just solve each one. All right, so let's do number 5. So on the left side, what's my real term? X. On the right side, what's a real term? 9. Because those are the 2 things that don't have i's. So I would say x is equal to 9. Do I have to do anything to solve for x? No, it's already solved for us. Perfect. Now let's do the same thing with the imaginary parts. What's my imaginary part on the left side? 3i. What's the imaginary part on the right side? Negative yi. So we'd say 3i is equal to negative yi. What would we do to solve for y? we can divide by I. So it cancels out the i's on both sides. So we have 3 is equal to negative y. Is that my answer? No, I need to get y all by itself. So what do I do next, Andrew? Divide both sides by negative 1. So we're moving the negative to the other side. So we get negative 3 is equal to y. So these would be our 2 answers. All right, let's do number 6. What's a real part here? 9 and negative 2x. So the two things that don't have an I would be 9 and negative 2x. So we'd say 9 equals negative 2x. What are our imaginary parts? 4yi and 3i. So we'd say 4yi is equal to 3i. So let's solve for x first. What would I need to do to solve for x? Divide by negative 2. So here, x is equal to, we can just leave it as a fraction, so it'd be negative 9 over 2. Any questions? For y, what would I need to do to solve for y? Divide by 4i. Awesome. We want to get rid of everything that's attached to the y. So since 4 and I are being multiplied to it, we want to divide it to move it to the other side. So we have y is equal to what? 3 over 4. Perfect. So those would be our 2 answers. You don't write it as coordinate points here. It's just x equals and y equals. So we can also add and subtract with our complex numbers. Just make sure you're adding or subtracting like terms. So if your number has an I, it can only be added to other terms with i's. So imaginary parts can only be added to imaginary. Real parts can only be added to real parts. So if we're adding, we can just get rid of the parentheses and combine our like terms together. So I'm going to drop the parentheses. And then start with combining the real parts. So what's 9 minus 6? 3. And then let's add our imaginary parts. What's negative I plus 7i? Awesome. This is like saying negative 1i, and negative 1 plus 7 would be 6. So this would be 6i. When you write your answer, you always want to write the real part first, then your imaginary part second. Yeah. Let's do number 9. What do you think I have to do first for number 9? Awesome. Let's distribute the negative to everything behind it. So it turns into a negative 8 and a plus 2i. Now let's combine our real parts together. So I have 3 minus 8. What's 3 minus 8? Negative 5. And then let's combine our imaginary parts. What's 7i plus 2i? 9i. So our answer would be negative 5 plus 9i. Again, make sure your real part comes first and the imaginary part is second. What should I do first for number 10? Distribute the negative. So that the first negative gets distributed to the 1 and the I, so it turns into negative 1 and negative I. We also have to distribute the second negative to the 5 and the 9i, so it'd be minus 5 minus 9i. So let's start with combining our real parts together. So 4 minus 1 and minus 5. What's 4 minus 1? Negative 4 minus 1. Negative 5. And negative 5 minus 5. Awesome. Negative 10. Now let's combine our imaginary parts. What's negative I minus 9i? Negative 10i. And again, make sure the real part always comes first. We can also multiply with complex numbers. when you're multiplying, again, just make sure you write your answer in standard form, which means that the real part comes first. So for A, when we multiply, we're just distributing the 4i to both things inside the parentheses. So what's 4i times negative 6? Negative 24i. And what's 4i times I? Awesome, 4i squared. Now if we go back to the second slide, what did we say that I squared is equal to? Negative 1. So anytime we see an I squared, we want to change that to be negative 1. Well, what is 4 times negative 1? Negative 4. So this is negative 24i minus 4, because 4 times negative 1 would be negative 4. Is this in standard form? What would have to come first for it to be in standard form? The negative 4. So we'd say negative 4 minus 24i. So remember, the real part comes first. And then anytime you see an I squared, you have to change it. So with B, yeah, that would be our final answer. For B, how do I multiply these two together? FOIL. So we're going to start by multiplying our first. What's 9 times negative 4? Negative 36. The outsides, what's 9 times 7i? 63i. The insides, what's negative 2i times negative 4? Positive 8i. And then the last, what's negative 2i times 7i? Negative 14. How many i's do I have? 2, so I squared. Anytime we have an I squared, what do we want to do to it? Change it to be negative 1. Well, what's negative 14 times negative 1? Positive 14. So that changes to be a positive 14. What do you think I need to do next? Combine like terms. In our answer, what comes first, the real or imaginary? The real. So let's start with adding our real parts. What is negative 36 plus 14? Negative 22. And then let's add our imaginary parts. What's 63i plus 8i? 71i. Awesome. This would be our answer. This little box here says, when simplifying an expression that involves complex numbers, be sure to simplify I squared as negative 1. So don't forget to do that. Anytime you see an I squared, you want to change it to be negative 1. All right, for 11. 11, we just have one term times another term. There's no plus or minus here. So let's just multiply these two together. What's negative 3i times 10i? Negative 30. How many i's do I have? 2. So I squared. What do we change I squared to be? Negative 1. So what's negative 30 times negative 1? Positive 30. So our answer would be positive 30. For 12, what would we need to do to multiply here? Awesome. Distribute. So what's I times 8? 8i. What's I times negative I? Negative I squared. Well, what is I squared? Negative 1. What is negative times negative 1? Positive 1. So that changes to be a positive 1. So we have 8i plus 1. Can I leave my answer like this? I have to flip it. I need to put it in standard form. So the real part has to come first. So 1 plus 8i. This would be our answer. Make sure the real part comes first. What do I need to do for 13? FOIL. So let's start by multiplying our first. What's 3 times 5? 15. Then the outsides, 3 times negative I, negative 3I. The insides, what's I times 5? 5I. And then the last, what's I times negative I? Negative I squared. What should we do next? Before I combine like terms, what do? Change the I squared to be negative 1. Well, what's negative times negative 1? Positive 1. Now what can we do? Now we combine like terms. In our answer, do we put the real part or the imaginary part first? Real part. So let's start by adding our real parts together. What's 15 plus 1? 16. Now our imaginary parts, what's negative 3I plus 5I? 2I. So this would be our answer.